Hey everyone, and welcome to the 57th episode of DF Direct Weekly. It's our weekly show where we discuss the latest gaming and technology news in a kind of dry spot for news, which makes the whole point of this show quite challenging, but we shall persist nonetheless. Joining me to discuss it, first of all, John Linneman.
Rich, good to be here, I think at least. I mean, the news is slim, but we have some interesting things to discuss today.
Absolutely, and of course, Alex Battaglia.
You know, this can become a DF variety show if all else fails in the dry weeks. You just bring on guests, do game show stuff.
Yeah, you could do some singing, ventriloquist acts perhaps. That'd be awesome. Okay, look, let's crack on and talk about the paucity of news. And our first news story this week. Okay, so this one is quite interesting. Kingdom Hearts 4 had a reveal trailer, and basically the concept of Kingdom Hearts 4 being announced at all lends further credence to what we refer to here as Jensen's prophecy, which is essentially a while back there was a leak from GeForce Now which seemed to show the entire roadmap for the software industry going forward years. And yes, Kingdom Hearts 4 was on this list, and it has been revealed. Thus far, the Jensen's prophecy has a 100% accuracy rating, I believe. But John, I'm going to go to you first because, well, what do you reckon of the trailer itself?
I was actually impressed with it. I saw some critique, but I really liked the way it looked. I thought that it kind of has a neat vibe, that sort of like overcast Tokyo look with that a lot of indirect lighting. And I like the changes they made to the character designs. I think Sora in this one actually looks more like Sian Barzad from The Bouncer. You know, if they can get Ko Leifo in there, I'm all about it. But I was thinking, though, that the fact that I do like the way it looks makes me wonder if fans of Kingdom Hearts do not. Because I am not a fan of Kingdom Hearts. I mean, it has some neat ideas, but I never really liked the way it played, and the storytelling is just kind of going off the rails. But this does almost feel like a clean break, and I have to wonder if it will be. You know what I mean? Like it lacks that intense busyness that we saw in pre-release media from prior games. I don't know what you guys think, but I mean, I guess the main thing to talk about here is the fact that it's Unreal Engine 5, right?
That was the obvious thing, right? Like, you can see the off-screen reflections of the giant monster in the building. I was getting weird, like, what was the name of that game that never came out? It was like Final Fantasy 13 Versus vibes from it. I don't really know why, but
I mean, it kind of reminds me of Final Fantasy 15 itself in some of the city environments.
Exactly, right? So maybe there's some continuity there in terms of, I don't know, design that we're going to be seeing. But the trailer itself was interesting. I don't actually know in the end how it'll pan out, because we have yet to see Unreal Engine 5 running in anything other than demo form in a lot of places. And, I'm just curious to see what stuff sticks and what doesn't in the end there. Regarding the Jensen's prophecy, peace be upon him, there is...
Got to get that
there's
trendy.
So much
hashtag Jensen's prophecy.
Hashtag Jensen's prophecy. Hashtag peace be upon him. There's so many really awesome games in that list, and so many of them have come true. We've seen God of War come out, come into existence. I think Crisis 4 was also the one where it's like, there's no way that's happening. But yes, it is happening. So I just think this list, other than the obviously canceled projects, like there have already been discussions, like that this list contains entries of things that at one point in time were in development, but then ceased. Like the obvious one, I think, is Titanfall 3, where that most definitely is not coming back because they've already announced that they're working on like 6,000 or 7,000 Star Wars projects there at Respawn. And, so I think this list in the end is really awesome. It points out a lot of games that I'm really excited about for coming to PC, and specifically one that I talked about and put in my Game of the Year list video last year was Returnal. That is also on the list, even at a point in time. I think it was before Returnal. Returnal had just come out when this list was leaked. that is definitely going to be coming to PC, and I cannot wait to see it.
I will say my one complaint with this trailer specifically is that it's something that they did in Kingdom Hearts 3 as well. They're not using motion blur during the gameplay segments. And I don't know why. It's exactly what they did in Kingdom Hearts 3, and they seem to be doing it again. I suspect it's just somebody working on the team, one of the designers just decided they don't like the way it looks, and they've opted to disable it, but I really wish it was present, because I think it would really sell the visuals as looking more CGI-like in motion.
For sure. I think, one thing that probably ties into that, didn't Kingdom Hearts 3 also have like a really wonky unlocked frame rate in its normal gameplay as well too?
Indeed, yes.
In its original form, it was basically solved once it moved over to the next gen consoles. If you played on like a PS5 or a Series X, then it's like locked 60, but
yeah, that would also be something that motion blur would definitely help a lot with some frame rate issues. Yeah.
Well, it is Unreal Engine 5, and perhaps unsurprisingly, what we did get to see was a city, which seems to be what Unreal Engine is really good at, basically.
Well,
sort of
needs some rocks in there.
Cities and rocks. That's why we need Motorstorm made in Unreal Engine 5 now, because like that, the Valley of the Ancients is perfect for it. Like just throw some buggies in there and it's all good. You could run over that character from the original demos and watch it ragdoll around the screen. It'd be awesome.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Is there anything more to say about Kingdom Hearts 4? Because obviously it's early days at the moment, and they're keeping most of their powder dry, I'd say, based on the content.
Two things. They removed the clown shoes. So Sora has like normal size feet now, it seems, or at least smaller shoes, which is a very positive change. Secondly, there was a teaser for the Star Wars stuff in there, which is fascinating, and I'm curious to see what they do there.
This game's storyline, I don't know, man. It's like metaverse crap.
I mean, I can't complain about it because a lot of people love that. It's just not for me.
So did you check out when the characters from Frozen turned up, John?
No.
No.
You're a big Frozen fan then?
I've never seen Frozen. I've managed to avoid this.
That's your loss. Okay, so well, that's Kingdom Hearts 4. I guess, as I said, very early days. We'll get to see more further on down the line, I guess. But we actually did have a supporter question related to Jensen's prophecy from Ralger. What game on the profit list, courtesy of Nvidia, are you most looking forward to? So you're kind of, I guess you've already made your pitch, right, Alex? Returnal.
Mm-hmm.
From my perspective, it's got to be Crysis 4, which has now been confirmed. Further confirmation of the veracity of Jensen's prophecy.
Well, I saw Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3 on there, specifically like HD again. And if they were to do a new enhanced version of that, I would like that, especially if it was more than just the original HD release, but like a further touched up enhanced version. I think that would be awesome to see.
Well, there's been rumours circulating for years now that MGS 2 and 3 were redone on the Fox engine.
Man, and
then there's the Pachinko machine in Japan that has lots of cutscenes from the, I think MGS 3, actually remade in the Fox engine, seemingly.
That would be perfect because you could essentially you could remove the split map design of 2 specifically, and introduce the more nuanced controls of Metal Gear Solid 5, and I think really do some interesting gameplay design based on those original games. I think it would be a lot of work to do it well if you really wanted to fully remake them. So I'm not sure if Konami's willing to spend the money to go that far, but I sure hope they do. Just, because I don't really trust them necessarily to be able to make a new game at this point in that series. They don't have the internal studios capable of that, I don't think. Although they could farm it out, of course. But I don't know. I'd like to see it.
So this one dropped just as we were about to film, and essentially it looks like the next generation patch for The Witcher 3 is in a state of limbo at the moment. CD Projekt Red has taken back the project from an unnamed third-party studio, and has essentially said, okay, we're in command now, and we've got no release date for this project whatsoever, when originally it was due to be released in Q2, when we're in Q2 now. I don't know, John, any thoughts on this? I mean, there's not really that much we can comment on here because the announcement is the announcement, right?
Well, it's kind of unsubstantiated, as you might say, but the current theory is that they were using Saber Interactive's Russian studio, which actually did work on Crysis 1, 2, and 3 remastered, except for the Switch version, which was done in Sweden. But with obviously the conflict happening in Ukraine and the sanctions in play, it does seem possible and likely even that a Polish company like CD Projekt Red would essentially want to back away from such a partnership. Though at the same time, I mean, it's an interesting one because Saber Interactive is a very large company and they have many different branches. But it does seem like the Russian studio specifically was often working on projects like this. So I could see that being the reason, in which case they would have to take back the work that was being done and essentially analyze it and figure out, like, all right, what needs to be done? What's missing? Like, what do we need to do here? Like, basically taking a half-finished project and then completing it. That's a decent amount of work, I think. And they're going to have to pull resources off other projects to get that done, I'd imagine. So I'm not surprised that if they're moving it in-house, it has to be delayed. We just don't know how long it's going to take, I guess, right?
Yeah, so Alex, we're sort of talking about this project and thinking about Xbox Series and PlayStation 5 consoles. But, The Witcher's always had legs on PC. And I'd imagine that if you're going to be doing a next-generation patch for The Witcher 3, you would probably want to put a fair amount of effort into a PC port. Into a PC version, rather. I mean, especially when you look at what the company did with Cyberpunk. I mean, I guess it's still all sort of conjecture at this point, but what would you want to see from an upgraded version of The Witcher 3?
So in the CDPR hack, if you recall that, there was, leaked file names and things like that, and probably also leaked other stuff that I didn't touch, obviously. But the rumor mill around that was that it was called Witcher RTX internally, which is interesting. So I would assume they would go back in and add in ray tracing stuff into it. And I think the obvious areas of improvement would be changing the way just global dynamic lighting is done. It was done in a way that was systemic in the original Witcher 3, where they had just like light probes around the world, essentially like cube maps, and they were artist place always, and they would be updated based upon the time of day. If you rip that out with another systemic solution like RTGI in any one of its many forms, of which there are a lot now, with like the Lumen, the way Metro is doing it, RTXGI, DDGI, blah, blah, blah. There's so many. That would be an amazing way to improve the game's visual quality without needing to touch the assets so much so. But, that's the problem with these remasters in general, and something that we saw with Crysis 1 remaster, I would say more so than any other, is that you have to have a fine hand in updating the assets and the lighting situations and the color grading to actually, I would say, adhere to the original stylistic guidelines that the game set up for itself. And that was less successful in Crysis 1 Remastered. I would say more successful in Crysis 2 Remastered, Crysis 3 Remastered. And I think, honestly, for whatever reason they did bring this back in-house into the studio, whether it be for quality, whether it be for the reason that John mentioned, which also I think seems likely, it means they're going to have more control, and we're going to have people that are actually care about the Witcher's look in a way that, it's CD Projekt Red. And I think them bringing it in-house has a greater chance of it being a higher quality remaster in the end, in terms of actually looking like The Witcher 3, but just a lot better. Instead of looking kind of similar, like we don't want the Arkham, Arkham City remaster happening here. Return to Arkham, that's what it's called, yeah. We don't like that. So that's what I'm hoping this signals.
But what do you think the possibilities are for the consoles, bearing in mind that what CD Projekt Red actually delivered on Cyberpunk was actually fairly limited?
Yeah, that game was already really heavy at its base, right? And I think with The Witcher 3, we've already seen it running at, like, what is it, like checkerboard, like 4K on PS4 Pro. It's already pushing res there, even at its medium/low settings or whatever it's using. It's still a handsome looking game in spite of all that. That's a lot of GPU headroom on a next-gen console, I would say, based upon how we know how it runs on things like RX 5700 XTs and things like that. So I think, I think they actually have a pretty good chance of implementing a good output resolution version of ray tracing in there. Another thing I would also really like to see, just in general across all versions, is a different anti-aliasing solution. It's fine enough, but it's like kind of rudimentary. It came out around that time when TAA was like it was still not completely standard practice in like the way we see it today. I guess, but if all else fails in the end, ray trace shadows would also be a good way to improve the quality of this game, because the shadows, they extended into the distance in The Witcher, but they had some severe performance implications if you would turn them up more than, like, let's say 100 meters in front of the character. And something like ray trace shadows would be more expensive in general, but they would also apply much better to the world and holistically.
Yeah, I think ray trace shadows in the case of The Witcher would make a lot more sense than they did in something like Cyberpunk, just due to the nature of the terrain and the foliage. You have all those long draw distances, tons of like little pieces of foliage and everything. I think it would look really good.
We've had an inkling that this one has been happening for quite some time, but rumours are gathering pace that coming in November we'll actually get to see the new Need for Speed game from Criterion. Not much is known about it, very little. There are indications that it's going to be appearing only for the current gen consoles. It's not a cross-gen project, which I find quite exciting. But there's not really that much more to say about it. But I guess we're just sort of talking about the potential of what this project could offer, and the potential offered by only running on a current gen system. John, any thoughts on this? Because obviously, I mean, we're all fans of the Criterion Need for Speed games. Hot Pursuit in particular. I mean, what do you want from this one?
Oof, this is a difficult one, because I feel like Need for Speed has had some rough years since then, to be honest. I know there was the Ghost Games period, and they've released several, and I don't feel like any of them have really hit. They just didn't nail what Need for Speed was all about. And to be fair, Need for Speed has been about many things over the years. But as an old fan of those originals, as well as like the Underground era and all that, I really, really hope that there's two things in play here. First of all, they really need to look back at what made these games great in the first place, and I hope they've internalized this and have built a game with that in mind, while still taking it in a new direction. I'm sure it's going to be open world. I would love a track-based game again, but I just know that's not going to happen. But that's okay. If they looked at, I feel like taking a combination of what Forza Horizon does with the classic Need for Speed Underground, for instance, could make for a really interesting combination. But beyond that, I think it's pretty clear. So they were pulled off apparently to help with Battlefield last year, to ship that. Battlefield was a disaster. Electronic Arts knows this. Everybody knows this. It was not good. It didn't go well for them. And I hope they understand, like, okay, Need for Speed is still a thing. It's still a popular thing, and they need to nail this. They can't have this be a Battlefield. Now, I think there's less chance of that because it's just inherently a less complex sort of idea in a way. Well, at least the logistics side of things. You're not dealing with these gigantic multiplayer kind of battles and hundreds of people running around in the same space. That's always a chance for bugs everywhere. But between those two things and the long development time, I'm really, really, really hoping that they've figured something out here, and we'll get a proper return to form for Need for Speed, focused on next generation machines that allows them to cast aside any of the technical issues that they had faced on last generation consoles. I want to see them go for 60 frames per second. I don't know if they will, but I really hope so. There's just, without knowing more, we can't say much more than our hopes for it, but that's kind of where I'm at with Need for Speed. So I don't know about you guys.
Well, we've got this question from supporter Nicholas Z, Hi DF crew, with the rumoured Need for Speed game targeting current gen, are there any new ideas or techniques you'd like to see games try with the greater bandwidth? For an open world racing game, instantaneous switches to the race, replacing loading screens, seems like a no-brainer. Are there any new ideas that could be done or are currently emerging? To John, imagine if this was applied to a new Sonic Unleashed style game. No more stuttering and popping! Exclamation point. But Alex, what do you reckon about what is open to Criterion for doing, a next generation or current generation only title with this franchise?
I feel like I also echo John's that they need to capture some of the older spirit there, and I don't know how they're going to do it, but technically I feel like there are some low-hanging next-gen fruit of things that they could and really should consider doing. Is I honestly think a lot of racing games these days, John, is just taking a look at Motorstorm. It would be really cool if they had a crash model that was really convincing. It's not like this game needs to be a sim racer or anything like that. So that some sort of flair in the game via like how crashes occur, using, for example, like soft body physics and having like actual deformation of the car, things like that, like actual car tires that like, compress and move and things like that. I would really love to see that in game, and actually that's a great way to use the next-gen power there. There's the other things you mentioned there, Nick, are, I think that's like what we're starting to expect out of a lot of the games these days: low loading times, really quick transfers between places in an open world. And I imagine that's what this game is going to be trying to focus on in the end, because, like, let's be honest, that's just like en vogue right now of terms of how to do like games in general and racing games especially. One thing though that I'm wondering if, like, why anyone hasn't done it yet is, aren't the last Need for Speed games kind of really trying to be like the Fast and the Furious films, like in terms of like visual styling, story? There's stories. There's like stories here. Isn't that what they're trying to do usually? I'm just surprised that IP has not been utilized so much for a game, because they're stupidly popular movies, but it almost feels like that would be a way to do Need for Speed, right?
I mean, there was Fast and the Furious for Forza Horizon 2. There was a specific Fast and the Furious tie-in, but...
Really? Okay.
Well, look, if we go back to Hot Pursuit, what did Criterion do? First of all, they stripped out all story, really. Secondly, they stripped out the concept. I mean, prior Need for Speed titles to the Criterion one, you start out in an incredible car. Then for various reasons, you get busted down to like a Ford Focus or a Golf or something like that. And essentially, Criterion's approach was to say, this is actually a really bad thing to do to the player. Just give them good cars right from the beginning, and lots of good cars. And that's kind of where they went from there.
You're not wrong, Rich, but I think it depends on the game. I do think there's value in starting from a lower end car and working your way up. And it's something that I actually have an issue with in some modern games. Like, you look at Forza Horizon 5, I love that game, but they're just dishing out like supercars left and right from the start, right? But they have these lower end vehicles as well, but you're never really incentivized to use them, so that it doesn't feel like there's a real progression there. And I actually kind of miss that to some degree.
The philosophy with Need for Speed was that, what is the Need for Speed brand? It's about getting behind the wheel of these exotic cars and flooring them, right? That was their take.
But then you look at like Need for Speed Underground, which is awesome and was very popular. I mean, that starts you with like a Honda Civic that you like tune up, right? And there is a lot of fun to be had there. So it just kind of depends on what flavor of Need for Speed they're trying to channel here, I suppose.
I guess another question, which is sort of arisen from the points you've made here, is that a lot of what Criterion were doing with Hot Pursuit seems to have evolved into Forza Horizon.
Right. Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
It is essentially the same formula, but ramped up to the nth degree, and it does have technical chops. I think Criterion are facing a really big challenge here, and it's not a big studio anymore, or it ever was, really. So I'm going to be really interested to see what the scale and scope of this project is. And I'd like to see, a ground-up approach just from a conceptual basis, from an ideas basis, as there was in Hot Pursuit. We had, they basically revolutionized the online leaderboard model, the auto log. I mean, is there any scope for new ideas? That's really what I'm hoping for, as well as the sort of technical chops.
Do you remember in Most Wanted, they had that system where they would have cars scattered around the world, and you could basically drive up to those cars if you found them somewhere, and then just immediately switch over and then
That's a
start
smart
driving
idea.
the car. That game has so many cool things in it. It's very, very slick.
Yeah, and a lot of the original staff who worked on Hot Pursuit and Most Wanted are still at Criterion. So
That's true. A good
like
number of them are. That's true.
I'd like to think that they're sort of champing at the bit and have got years worth of potential ideas that they'd have put into this game, and I really can't wait to see what they've come up with. But let's move on to the next topic. We do like to complain here at Digital Foundry, and but in this case, and I'd say in most cases, there is actual justification for the complaints, and we're going to be talking about the LG C2. So here's the thing: all the way back to, I guess, the B6, we've been championing LG as the brand for your 4K television purchase. I mean, John and I, we've gone through a few LGs. It's just the definitive gaming screen. But there were some issues that started to crop up with the C1, and with the C2, it looks like there are some profound issues with the screen, possibly more in the sort of niche feature set, but it's certainly problematic. Why don't you talk us through it, John?
Yeah, so I kind of want to highlight this to hopefully shine a light on it. Maybe LG will take notice. I'm not sure. So basically what's happened here is a friend of the show, Mark Triforce Duddleson from My Life in Gaming, he's been using an LG C7 for a while and decided, all right, let's upgrade to the C2. Wait a minute. C7, C2. Oh, yeah, I guess they just kind of reset the numbers there. We'll get back to C7 at some point.
It works based on the year, right? We're in 2022, so we're in a 2
That's
phase.
true. That's true. So,
Why not just D, then D?
I joined up
don't
with
know.
him on a Discord call right when he got it, and we kind of just walked through it and tested all kinds of stuff on it. And it became pretty clear early on that there's some weirdness with the firmware, specifically with a couple areas, input latency and black frame insertion, as well as the actual frame persistence. So firstly, this is probably the most egregious issue, is he was actually testing the black frame insertion issue and noticed that it kept sort of flickering every 10 seconds. You would get like a weird flash, and he was trying to figure out what the heck's going on here. But it turned out that was actually just a symptom of another problem where by inputting certain resolutions, and he's not even clear what actually triggers it, the TV ends up going into a high latency mode where the frames are delivered incorrectly and the actual input lag is like tripled or quadrupled. So if you're just in a normal game mode, it's normally around 8 or 9 seconds if you measure the top left corner with, like, say the...
I hope that's 8 or 9 milliseconds.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
8 or 9
long
seconds
delay.
lag would be
Sorry,
quite remarkable.
8 or 9
Incredible.
milliseconds. 8 or 9 seconds, yeah, that would be, wow, that would be something. Yes, 8 or 9 milliseconds around there. And then once this issue starts to rear its head, he noticed that it goes up to 40-something. And at the same time, when just watching a movie is when he first noticed it, but then it appears in games, essentially the TV seems to be skipping frames when it's in this mode, where like you'll like have a smooth pan and then it skips and judders and skips and judders. And the only way to get out of it once this happens is to do a factory reset of the TV. So this happened multiple times to him where it's just the TV gets stuck in this high latency mode. The frames are not delivered consistently. It doesn't look right. And then the only way to fix it is to factory reset. And you have no idea when or why it's going to trigger again. So that was extremely frustrating. And I think that's probably ultimately that's the death knell for him on that one. But also, I've mentioned before also he found, the peak brightness in SDR specifically, he hasn't been able to match the C7 for some reason, which is unexpected. Now, they may have made some tweaks to it. I don't know what his settings on the C7 are, but he was actually trying to go for that intense, vibrant look, I guess, and was not able to get the new C2 up to the same level of brightness. Beyond that, it uses the LG OLED Evo panel. And the weirdest thing you notice there is that when you look at the screen off axis, sort of with checking the viewing angles, or there's light reflected off of it, it develops this pinkish tinge. So you'll be looking at like a white screen, you tilt your head to the side, and the screen kind of gets like a pinkish hue to it. That doesn't happen on the older OLED models, the pre-Evo panels. So that's another strike against it. And then on top of that, we already know they removed the black frame insertion feature from 120 Hz content, and it's only a single option for 60 Hz content that's less effective, but still decent enough. But it is a shame that they removed it for 120, so they're basically dialing down the feature that some of us, not everyone, but some of us really, really like, which is a huge deal, I think. And here's the craziest thing. This is only going to apply to a select few people, but you know, he's obviously big into retro games, right? He's inputting like the retro tink in there. Often he likes to use the 1920 by 1440 mode, which is a 4:3 resolution. So you would actually engage that, get your pixel scaling right. You set your TV to 4:3 mode. But here's the problem. When you engage any other picture mode except for the widescreen mode, the full widescreen mode, the input lag is increased. So basically by turning on 4:3 mode, it goes from like 8 milliseconds up to like 40 or something. And it's just like, why? So of course we test, I tested my CX in 4:3. It's fine. Other people test like the C1, C9, some of the older ones, all fine. The C2 though, it just completely breaks down. And I think there's even more. He's actually doing a full video on this with a lot of details, and he's going to reveal what he ends up doing in the end as well. But I wanted to mention it here specifically so that it's like LG is aware that there's issues right now, and that I actually think this might be the least stable firmware they've ever released in the last few years for their OLED screens, which is kind of shocking to me that it would have all these problems like this out of the gate, considering how long they've been doing this. And I do suspect that they will fix most of them and hopefully all of them in time. But it's concerning because you buy this, you have like a limited period where you can return the screen, but you don't know like when is LG going to fix this and will they ever fix this, right? And I feel like this kind of stuff really needs to be highlighted because it's a little bit troubling.
There should be, quite how those bugs made their way through to the production unit is baffling. I'm just wondering whether, when we go back to the CX, which is the screen that you and I have got, John, this screen launched when Xbox Series X was launching. We know that Microsoft was in close collaboration with LG during that period. We were given beta firmwares to test. And I'm just wondering whether there's still that collaboration with, the maker of a games machine, be it Microsoft. It's unlikely to be Sony. I'm just wondering whether, the lack of collaboration with a platform holder might be causing some of the issues here. But that said, I doubt Microsoft would be testing 4:3 content on a... But even so, it is troubling because, this has been our easiest recommendation we have for equipment upgrade is, you just go for LG. It's the natural route forward. They make OLED panels. OLED panels are the best. You buy an LG. So to get these issues on the new product, specifically where they're removing features as well as introducing these bugs, that's problematic from my perspective. And I'm just kind of happy I got the CX at this point.
Same, yeah.
Yeah. One thing to mention that I've been watching HDTV, Vincent's stuff, because he just did a video regarding the C2 42-inch or 43-inch. I always forget how many inches it is. The smaller panel that they're bringing out as part of this. And interestingly, it's not using the Evo panel.
Which seems like it might actually be a good thing.
It may be a positive at the end, which is kind of really interesting. So I imagine a lot of the firmware stuff that John was talking about applies to it, but from what I understand, the pinking issue, which is a weird verb. I don't want to use that again. When you look at the side and you see the pink in the white, you definitely, apparently don't get that on the 42-inch model. But all the stuff that John's talking about, including the BFI removal from 120 hertz content, completely soured my desire to have this be my replacement monitor for my PC because I kind of like the full feature set that John is always talking about and using. That's why I was so interested in that panel in the first place. And seeing it go backwards in time in terms of feature set and scalability, well, I'm probably at the moment, I'm not going to bite the bullet, and I'm actually going to probably not get the C2 at the moment. So lost a customer there, potential customer. What a shame.
I'm just saying, Alex, 48-inch CX.
I know. I could do that. That's
you
true.
You could do that. It would solve all of your problems. Okay,
well,
let's move on. That's the end of the news. We're going to be talking about some content and some other things right now, and we're going to start with a continuation of discussion that we started last week with Unreal Engine 5. Now, at that point, Alex was working on the ray-traced Doom release, so there was a little bit of lag in our coverage. Now, we have had a closer look at Unreal Engine 5. It may well be the case that Alex's video has gone up, but this is quite an interesting situation, isn't it, Alex? We've got a situation here where Epic is essentially redefining the rendering paradigm. It's clear that this is not going to be an easy transition. Unreal Engine 5 has been released to developers. Games are in development. Potentially game-changing in terms of the style of visuals that we're going to be getting. But certainly in terms of the sample software that we have to look at, man, this is super, super heavy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so like just at the front of all this, you always have to like read this in the context of what it is. These are not what they're providing on PC as samples are not polished demos released for console. It is not, unfortunately, the level of polish that you'd see of like the Matrix Awakens demo put on, you know, your Xbox Series X, your PS5s and things like that. These are just running the stock settings that Unreal provides to you, that it runs at, like it defaults to SG, quality settings 3, which is high, not even epic or cinematic quality. So you have to put that in that context. And it's also releasing, on PC, like you're grabbing the sample and you're exporting it out as a shipping, or I've been exporting as development build, which doesn't do anything other than just enable the console, for example, which is also very useful for testing things out. You're not seeing a lot of the optimizations a developer might put into a retail game. Like I'm not exporting it with any of the PSO creation stuff because it's actually a very complex process and I don't have a week's time to learn it and do it. So there's a lot of things that a developer would do that we cannot do in the allotted time for making a video, let alone what this whole sample is about. The sample is about getting developers used to the creation, the pipelines, everything in there that is about what Unreal Engine 5 offers and how you can start creating with it. So that's what it's about. But the whole thing is you can export these things as projects, and they are visually and, like gameplay-wise and all the things in them. It's basically what you're getting there in the city part of the Matrix Awakens demo. It's almost the exact same thing. I found like one or two differences is that sometimes like some of the procedural generation stuff looks a little different, but that's about it. So that's what you're getting. And when you load that up, my goodness, I think the reactions on the web put it really well. It's just like, this is so heavy. It's so stupidly heavy that, like, if you're honestly looking out there at if anyone's benchmarked this, the chance of them actually having benchmarked a GPU in this are slim to none, because it's primarily CPU limited, which is interesting. It's worrying that we can talk about that for a bit, but it's interesting to see that the CPU is definitely being very much so used. I point this out in my video. For sure. So if you load it up, your experience is first shader compilation stutters, amazing. Then after that, you're going to feel what a CPU limited game looks and feels like on PC, and that's what makes it feel incredibly rough. On this GPU wise, it actually is running in a way that I think is very reasonable. But that's the problem, is because when you load up these things on PC, you just don't get that feeling like I'm looking at something that is polished next gen, interesting, because you're worrying about all these performance issues. And it just doesn't look good and it doesn't run well. And the reason why I even with all that context in the end, and I talk about it in the video, of this not being a production, release at all. It's not a retail release or something like that. But it does have a number of issues in it that point out things that make me a little worried about Unreal Engine 5 performance on PC in the end, even if, games are going to be striving for this exact level of visual quality. The one thing that really has me worried is actually the way CPU scaling is in general. In my video, I pointed out some bit about how AMD's hardware ray tracing performance is really weird due to CPU performance here. But in general, even on Nvidia, you're seeing this issue where the game scales really well. The sample, Unreal Engine 5 sample, scales really well with CPU frequency and not cores. And the thing is, ever since about 2000, let's say 2014, 2015, CPUs have been getting a lot wider, quicker than they've been getting faster on a per thread basis. And we're reaching limits of that with, 5, 7, 6, 3 nanometer. We're just going to be reaching limitations of frequency and things like that. And seeing a game targeting next gen or an engine feature set, this metahumans, this large scale content, the way ray tracing is handled, seeing it scale more with frequency and a lot more with frequency than it does with thread count is actually not very good. And that's not what you want to actually see out of something targeting next gen or current gen in that way. And I'm a little worried as a result of that games that are going to target 30 FPS with Unreal Engine 5, which I actually do think is still the target for Unreal Engine 5 based upon everything I've seen, that they're going to scale at least initially in a way on PC that we're not used to seeing with PC titles, where getting 60 FPS is not at all easy. I'm really worried about that regarding Unreal Engine 5 on PC. I don't know how you look at this, John or Rich, but I love the rendering tech being on Showcase here. It scales visually on PC in a way that I like usually, but like the CPU performance of the sample does, it's a lot of question marks there. What exactly is going to happen in real Unreal Engine 5 releases?
We are kind of moving back towards old school PC in a way, though. Like, this is how PC gaming used to be. It was never, for years, just like load up a new game and bam, you get 60 FPS, no problem. It wasn't that way until like the late 2000 period, I would say. But that doesn't mean like I think you're absolutely right on the money about a lot of these things. And I think the CPU threading issues in particular, I hope those are solved, because I'm a little surprised by that, how heavy it is on the CPU. Like, I don't know, what was your max frame rate?
Like with actual cars in the street.
Yeah.
with the demo actually looking like the demo's supposed to look. I don't know. It's like maybe like 50, but that's like, it's constantly going down to like 30 and then 50. It depends on like what's in view.
Scaling the resolution way down. Like I did 25%. It doesn't look great using TSR. And I found that with my CPU, I was maxing out at about 65 frames per second. And that's using an i9 12900K, right? And most people playing PC games aren't going to have a CPU quite like that. And it was, at that point, it was hitting the limits of the CPU. So it does feel like, unless they significantly optimize the way that the engine is threaded, we're just going to have a lot of people really struggling to get decent performance on there. And then it's going to be about, the main thing is like, people are probably going to have to accept 30 FPS caps again, at least temporarily. And also, I am more concerned, though, about the shader compilation stutter. Like, I don't know if we can fully judge that here based on this demo, but this has been a significant problem with PC versions of games running on Unreal Engine 4 for years, right? I mean, every time a new game comes out with Unreal Engine, Alex loses a little bit of hair because he just, he can't stop pulling it out of it. He's just going crazy. And he's right. It's very, very, very annoying when your first experience with the game is kind of compromised by this constant stutter. And there is a real concern that it's going to be even worse in Unreal Engine 5 because they're just pushing the volume of shaders up through the roof, it seems like. And just the way Unreal's material system works, it almost seems like it's a problem that's going to be difficult to manage. Talking to different developers, I mean, the ones that have managed to solve these shader compilation stutters have basically focused from the very beginning, the early point of development, on essentially defining limits on what artists should be doing with shaders. And like, this is where we can use it, but don't go overboard with all these permutations. You know, try to keep this stuff in check, because if you just go crazy with it, by the end of the project, suddenly you're not going to be able to fix the issue, right? Without like baking out all this data, or just doing like huge, super long shader compilation. Which, by the way, I haven't actually tested this. I don't know if you guys have. Is it true that the Modern Warfare 2019 on PC has the option to like do like a full shader compilation pass, and it takes like 20 to 30 minutes?
Yeah, it does. And it allows you also to, if I recall, allows you to also decide whether you want to do it for multiplayer or single player. I may be thinking of another game, actually. But, you know, like putting that into the hands of the user seems really forward-looking. Modern Warfare, that's really well done.
I like that because, you know, not everybody's affected by these stutters, right? It's bothersome to us, but some people don't care, and that's fine. But for people that really want their first experiences to be good, I do think developers should provide options like this when possible, to basically allow you to prep your PC before playing the game, almost, you know, like a second installation, if you will. I think it's worth it to have the better experience. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think more options for PC gamers can only be a good thing, right? And, you know, what does the developer lose by doing it? I mean, I guess the one thing to bear in mind is that due to the nature of Unreal Engine, I don't think you can pre-compile every possible shader. You know, you're going to be talking hundreds of thousands, possibly. So, you know, but, you know, you can certainly mitigate it. And Epic has mitigated it in Fortnite. You know, they include shader compilation within Fortnite. So, you know, it definitely mitigates the issue there. So, you know, it should be doable, right? But I'm just sort of disappointed that games, and so many games from Unreal Engine, have shipped in this state with nobody thinking, hey, this isn't good. What can we do about it? I think the Ascent made a pretty good effort to fix the issue. But yeah, I mean, challenging, right? I mean, this isn't the way. The thing is, why does an enthusiast gamer go for PC? You know, they go for PC because they've got the funds available. They want to invest it in hardware. They want to have the best possible gaming experience, right? And it doesn't seem to matter what kind of hardware you've got. You're going to be running into these issues. And obviously, we had the issue with Elden Ring, which wasn't on Unreal Engine, so it's not specifically related to Unreal Engine only. It's simply just the popularity of UE4 is such that it's, you know, so many of these games have actually shipped with these issues. And I think it might be a QA, it might be problematic for QA because, you know, you see a stutter, you go back to retest it, and there isn't a stutter anymore because the shader has been compiled and cached.
There's no quick way to essentially reset that, right?
I think I've yet to do all these things. There's a lot of things that I've been doing. I've been for a couple of videos now, and I actually did it just recently for this Matrix video, is where I clean out the driver and I just let it run again to show off the issue, and I show them back side by side.
But that's not
like,
actually, that's not that quick.
It's not so easy, but there's technically using the Windows cleanup, you know, like what you've been able to do for years now. If you actually go to the advanced options there's the DirectX shader cache, which you can clear, but that may not clear all of them because sometimes games put them in different places. You know, they put their shaders in different compiled places in different shaders areas. So it's hard to, but the quickest way to do it is actually just a full-on driver wipe. And that does it. Takes like 5 minutes on my end. I'm just really curious though, Rich, like what do you think about the CPU performance? Because I do think like seeing a next gen engine and these features that we're talking about here, it's like these are the things that they want developers to use, and that's the whole point of the sample. They want to show the open world, they want to show the massive instancing, they want to show the AI populating it. Even if you take the AI out of the equation, which I also show in the video, you still see this threading and frequency issue. What do you think about that, Rich? I'm like really curious.
What do I think about it? Well, it's problematic, isn't it? Because, you know, pretty much since the arrival of, well, actually going back to PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, the biggest gains that we've seen from CPU utilization have been to basically soak all available threads and cores and to kind of mitigate single thread performance that way, right? Whether it's job-based solution, whatever. And typically games on the PC become unstuck when they are reliant heavily on single core performance, right? Because the paradigm has changed, and I think it changed significantly with the arrival of Ryzen 1000, where it wasn't so much about performant single cores anymore. It was about parallelization. It was about having lots of cores. And obviously AMD has improved performance, single thread performance. We do have really capable processors now, and that is actually causing me even more concern, because, we're looking at 10th gen core, 11th gen core having issues. John seems to be okay with 12th gen core, but the proliferation of those processors at the moment is really, really small. I just am wondering what the decision making was, and whether it is simply due to the sheer size of Unreal Engine with all of those different components in there, that integrating everything into a well-threaded system might be just overly challenging, right?
Also, like the reliance on Blueprint, and whether or not Blueprint, that Blueprint's all about being easy to access, making essentially what's the phrase, like scripting and easy to use things in a visual manner, but it doesn't necessarily lend itself to being perfectly multi-threaded, is another thing that I'm always a little bit worried about, like the ease of development, also making games just like so stupidly inefficient at the same time. So I don't know.
It does strike me as bizarre, because basically, at a minimum, we should be looking at an engine that's basically utilizing at least 6.5 cores, which is what PlayStation 5 has available for developers, and which rises to 7 on Xbox Series X. So, these are the baseline now. For the new era of gaming, and to rely on to see such things, we don't really know that it is relying on single thread. It's just what the performance characteristics are of this demo. So maybe there is more to it than meets the eye. And I think the other thing, of course, is that yes, the sample isn't a shipping product, but also I don't think Unreal Engine 5 is anywhere near its final form at the moment, even if it is on general release now to developers. I still think that, in the next year or so, we're going to be seeing rapid improvement in performance, simply because it has to be more performant. If you look at the Matrix Awakens, even though that is seemingly extremely streamlined compared to what we're seeing on PC at the moment, it's not a good performer. It still has a lot of issues. There's still a lot of technologies that need to be optimized within UE5. Still a lot of challenges to overcome there. And I think it will be solved simply because A, it has to be, and B, the talent that Epic has available is just phenomenal. But in the here and now, obviously it's just indicative of the state of play as things are in right now. But hopefully not when it comes to final shipping games.
Yeah, next year, Unreal 5.1, the Meat Cube is back. That's what I want to see.
Fair enough. Okay, let's move on to our next topic. And John, you're still working on DF Retro Motorstorm. And I'm really looking forward to this, having seen some of what you're up to. But one thing which is interesting, which is that how do you best play these games today? And obviously, they're still PlayStation 3 exclusive. The only way to improve that initial showing, I guess, is to use emulation, like a RPCS3. And you've been quietly impressed with that, right?
Up front, I will say I'm not a huge user of emulators. I respect them and they're important, but I don't really enjoy playing older games on an emulator, for a variety of reasons, and I don't think that they often look their best that way. That's fine, whatever. Plenty of disagreement there. But there is a line where that changes, and I think it's on the PlayStation 3 era, where you're starting to get to these more modern-looking games that are actually genuinely constrained by the resolution choices and some of the rendering characteristics of the machine. Like PS2, for instance, is designed for a CRT. It looks really good there. It's very, very crisp and sharp. I feel like when you try to emulate that on the PC, the higher resolutions actually kind of ruin the illusion to some degree, and it's not quite great. And emulation on PCSX2 is not great either, to be honest. But our PCS3, though, my goodness, what an amazing piece of software. I hadn't fiddled with this much until this project, but I am now a believer, and I'm absolutely floored by the results. So first of all, this week I finally got into testing it with the AVX512 stuff available on the recent Alder Lake CPU by disabling E-cores in the BIOS and enabling this. And it doesn't seem to be a huge gain for most applications, but our PCS3 specifically can take advantage of this, and it's basically allowed me to play a bunch of PlayStation 3 games at 4K 60 frames per second with 16x AF. It looks incredible. Like Metal Gear Solid 4 is one I just tested as well. It's nuts. It's like it finally realizes the vision. It's full 60 FPS now, because the game was originally unlocked anyway. But there's plenty of patches out now for various games, including Motorstorm, which I look at in the video. And I think they just said this week that now our PCS3 can boot every PlayStation 3 game. That doesn't mean they're all playable. It doesn't mean that they even necessarily get past the logo for the boot up. But every game now boots to some degree. And a lot of them are extremely playable. And Motorstorm, I would say, is up there. Well, Motorstorm Pacific Rift and Apocalypse, not Motorstorm 1. That has some pretty nasty issues, which I talk about. But I don't know. I mean, have you guys fiddled with this at all? Because I know you've tested on the Steam Deck, at least, but I'm just kind of blown away by what's possible with a really high-end machine.
Yeah, I think you're seeing it in its best possible light, John, with the 12900K, with AVX 512. I mean, I've tested our PCS3 with the PlayStation 5 CPU within the Ryzen 4700S. It's not pretty. Motorstorm Apocalypse, I did try that one. It's a slideshow. It's not great. So, yeah, I mean, it is the case where you can get phenomenal results with a really high-end CPU, but I think the PlayStation 5 is kind of like Zen 2, and that's not great for RPCS3. There'll be some games where you get some tremendous wins. For example, Ridge Racer 7, no problem, 4K 60 with that, no problem whatsoever. However, once you get into anything that's really utilizing the SPUs, it just grinds to a halt. I think I'll have to do a video on that, and maybe we should combine forces so we can actually see what this emulator can do when it has the hardware to really stretch its legs, because that is the future, right? I mean, that is the way things are going to be, once these super performance CPUs become more commonplace. But in the here and now, it's like, if you're on a Zen 2 CPU Ryzen 3000, it's there's going to be some games that run well. There's going to be a lot of games where if you use patches, you can get good results, because what they're doing is effectively, many of them are effectively removing SPU post-processing in order to boost performance. I think the big one is MLAA, which was that was distributed across, I think, 5 SPUs, 5 milliseconds processing time per SPU running in parallel. That's a huge amount of computational load being put onto the CPU via emulation. It just doesn't really work. So a lot of games are simply removing MLAA, and suddenly you're doubling performance. But yeah, I mean, I'm really impressed with what they've done here, and I have been talking to the developers when I was doing that work with the PlayStation 5 CPU. A bit of expectation management was put in place following those conversations. But also it was fascinating to see just how far it's come and how performant it is on high-end hardware. But there are still games like Far Cry 2, for example, that will really hammer performance, even on a high-end. Yeah. Apparently it's just because of the flood of draw calls that game is doing causes issues. That was what the developers of RPCS3 told me. But, I'd love to play Motorstorm at 4K 60. I'd love to play Killzone 2 4K 60. I mean, it just reminds me that there is a library of incredible games on that system which have kind of been left behind.
One of the big things I'm finding with PS3 is that the largest detriment to its image quality isn't necessarily the resolution, it's the way they filter their textures. It's like every game just uses like trilinear filtering, so textures just become soup like almost immediately. It's just blurry nonsense that you can't hardly parse. Whereas you look back at PlayStation 2, and I understand the critiques of this, but most PlayStation 2 games actually don't use maps at all. It was possible, and some games did, but most don't. And that does create sort of a noisier, shimmery look, but it also gives you this perception of more distant detail that actually looks pretty good in a lot of games. And I think PS3's trilinear filtering has aged a lot worse on that actual hardware. It ends up just kind of ruining the visuals of so many games. And Motorstorm is definitely there, like Pacific Rift. It's a great looking game, but man, when you put on 16x AF, it's like lifting a veil off everything. Even if you're just at 720p still, it's just, wow, what a difference.
I'd really love to do more investigation into this, and I actually think maybe we should be doing a video of Metal Gear Solid 4 running at 4K 60.
I was thinking that too. I feel like that's something to really showcase because it looks awesome.
And it's Audie's favorite game.
Yeah.
So win-win.
Right?
Exactly.
Win-win.
I have found, though, what's interesting is that there are still some slight micro stutter issues in spots that VRR completely cleans up. Because I had been playing with G-Sync for this, and I was like, man, these games are flawless. They feel perfect. And then I had to capture them, and I was like, oh, okay, there's actually still some little dips here and there where the milliseconds crawl up to like 18 or something for a frame for just a brief little period. So you get little bits of skips in the performance. Not a huge deal, but they're there. VRR cleans all that stuff up. So there's definitely a good use case for it.
Metal Gear Solid 4 on PS3, not so much micro stutter as macro stutter.
Macro stutter. Oh, I like this. I like this one. This is good.
The frame times on that game are kind of nuts.
Well, they use like a double buffer VSync, and like you can go from like looking at the sky and it's 60 FPS, and then you turn around and look at a bunch of particles and it's like 20, and you're just like,
oh my god,
I really want to see that content.
Pretty bad.
John.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
that's kind of funny.
I need to work on that then.
With PS3, I don't know why they did a double buffered VSync. It does seem like a Japanese dev studio kind of thing, honestly. Just like that's what they did.
Triple buffering was difficult. It was done a lot on PS3 actually, but it required a bit more memory, which was already kind of a limited thing.
That's what I was gonna say. Like, oh, they're saving 15 megabytes or something like that. Like they're saving the size of one frame buffer extra, which honestly, if you only have like maybe like I don't even like after like resources were taken away like from the OS, how much VRAM did the PS3 actually have? Did it have the full 256 or was it less?
I don't know.
Do you guys know?
I don't know where the system allocation came from.
Up until like during the early years on PS3, when you were in game, you couldn't actually get out to the OS. You still like at all. Like you would just hit the menu button and would just so like quit game, turn off controller, turn off system, and that's it on a black screen. Eventually, they allowed you to access some functions of the XMB from the game, but it was very slow and not very good, I would say. And most things required you to exit the game to access it. So I don't think they actually dedicated that much to the OS level because it doesn't seem to be doing a lot while you're playing a game. It's not like PS4, Xbox One, where you could actually back out to the OS menu and do stuff and then go back into the game.
There was an onerous system allocation in terms of memory that developers couldn't access there. It was always like 32 megabytes on Xbox 360, but it was I think it was at least 64 at one point on PlayStation 3, but it did get better across the generation.
But they had that stupid split memory configuration on PS3 as well, which everybody complained about. It's like you got two pools of 256 megabytes, and it's just like, that system, man, what a weird time. But you know what? You look back at the library now, especially like, I feel like that was still like the Sony from the PS1 and PS2 era. There's a lot of really interesting, creative, quirky games from their first party studio. And I feel like everything got very serious and cinematic with the PS4 in a way that I'm kind of bummed out by. You know what I mean?
Okay, we're going to move on now to supporter Q&A. And very quickly, we've got a big bunch of Steam Deck questions that I do want to address. And because we're pressed for time, I have to do it quite quickly. Number one, from Simplex. What is your opinion on Steam Deck's high-pitched fan whine? Were you able to verify that there is a quieter variant with another fan? Does Valve plan to do anything about it? I love my deck and I'd love to use it in bed, but it already managed to wake up my wife once. For me, the non-uniform high-pitched fan whine is deck's fatal flaw. Look, we haven't done any big investigation into different fans, but I would suspect that they're all the same, right? Because, you know, it's a production line fundamentally. There is a video out there showing that the development kits seem to be quieter, but, you know, we can't verify that.
It could be a fan curve thing, though, right? You know, like that can change between,
possibly, I don't know. And, you know, the thermal characteristics of any given processor will be different, which could have an impact on the fan noise. But yes, it is loud. Actually, not so much loud, but high-pitched, which is the issue. And it is, you know, problematic. I think we've said that before. And yes, my machine does it. And I guess yours does too, right, Alex?
Oh, yeah, it does, for sure.
Okay, fair enough.
So maybe the solution is to get like a large diameter fan. You shove a little screwdriver down in the vent so you block the fan on the Steam Deck so it can't spin. And you just make sure you play around the other fan.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
Let's do that.
We've got a couple of questions here which are broadly the same thing, and I think I covered it in the next generation tests. First one from a four-eyed geek: Steam Deck and image scaling related. Would Steam Deck or other platforms benefit from games having a native resolution UI with the 3D graphics at a lower resolution scaled up? I'm going to truncate the rest of that question because it's very similar to the next question. Hi DF, what are your thoughts on the upcoming technologies regarding upscaling via FSR 2.0 or Unreal Engine's TAA solution regarding the Steam Deck's resolution? Are we able to run games at a much lower native resolution like 360p and still expect an acceptable image quality at such low resolutions? Thanks for your thoughts. I think it's covered in the video, right? I mean, looking at Metro Exodus, which uses TAAU, and also there was a bit of footage in there of Ghostwire Tokyo using TSR, and of course Flight Simulator, TAAU. First of all, I think they're upscaling to 720p from like 504p actually looks really good blown up within that video, but it actually looks even better on the handheld screen. So absolutely, those technologies could be deployed to increase performance on Steam Deck. And a four-eyed geek talking about the native UI and 3D graphics at a lower resolution scaled up. Well, that's exactly what FSR integrated well and TSR and TAAU are doing. The idea is that persistent elements are at native resolution and the 3D elements aren't. That's kind of been there pretty much since the Xbox 360 era in terms of upscaling. Don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Alex, but, you know, absolutely FSR 2.0, provided it's performant, will actually do really good stuff based on what we've seen with other games using similar techniques.
Yeah, the one thing is that there just needs to be a proliferation of this being a standard thing in PC options menus. I honestly think it is in a lot of games now. It's pretty... You can really often find a resolution scaler option in most games, but sometimes you don't. And even Unreal Engine titles, Unreal Engine 4 titles, which it's been offered natively actually since Unreal Engine 3 days as a function in the engine, don't expose it in the UI, in the menu. In which case, for something like Steam Deck, you're going to have to dip into the INI file and just add in a line or two to do exactly what you want.
Yeah, I think the other takeaway is dynamic resolution scaling, as we saw in Metro Exodus. That would be a big win to actually have, you know, basically anything that works well on a console should be in the PC port, right? Because it adds scalability for lower end systems or higher performance on higher end systems. So, you know, absolutely. And the final question, quite an interesting one here from Beth Stavey. Hey guys, I've really been loving all the Steam Deck coverage and I'm really surprised by how well games hold up. I've been wondering about how direct storage or whatever Linux equivalent could do for performance in heavier titles like the UE5 demo. Presumably this should drastically reduce the CPU overhead, which should not only free up performance but also power budget for the GPU. Why didn't UE5 release with direct storage to begin with? Would there be a win there, Alex?
I don't know, because it depends on how the streaming from disk is being done at all. Because not every game will stream from disk in the exact same way, let alone on Unreal Engine. And if it is doing, I guess the thing that Beth here is hinting at, and with the pointing at direct storage, is the assumption that bringing stuff off of disk into memory is also using decompression, and that's running on the CPU. And as like the not released version of direct storage should have a version of GPU decompression in it, which runs much faster, obviously, and will bring much more data more quickly than a pure CPU decompression scheme, which games could be using. Under that assumption, and a game's performance was limited due to CPU performance, due to it constantly decompressing things, which I don't think is what we've at all evidenced in Unreal Engine 4 or 5 titles, let alone any title on PC yet, then that would be indeed a way to increase performance. But in general, I would say until, like, I don't think the games have been developed in this way yet. I don't think a lot of games are, the limiting thing in performance is CPU decompression. Like, maybe it was when, like, Rage came out all the way back in the day on id Tech 5. That could have been, like, if you upped the page file size there on PC, you could definitely see some CPU limitations. But games haven't been designed that way. So I don't think this is actually an issue in games, and I don't think it would really help the Steam Deck, but in the eventuality of time, of games actually pushing more because of the existence of direct storage, I don't know what's going to happen on Linux. I actually don't know, because I don't think there is an equivalent there of GPU decompression. They already have a different call stack anyways, but it would be doing it through Proton, and I just don't know how those line up, and I don't know if there's a direct storage equivalent for GPU decompression on Linux.
Okay, further supporter questions, and it's a return for my favorite Patreon hacker alias. It's agonizing rectal pain.
He's back. Yes.
He returns.
And,
or they return.
As usual, he's got actually a highly focused and interesting question to ask. In contrast to his amazing handle. How do you guys think the increased focus on CPU power in current gen consoles will affect game design trends going forward? Asking in regards to visual/technical design, as well as gameplay concepts, or even games/genres that could have better representation on consoles this gen. It's an interesting question, right, John? Because in this cross-generation era, essentially the CPU power is being used to develop like 60 FPS at 100 FPS modes. I guess with Unreal Engine 5, we're starting to see CPU power actually being properly utilized towards, a new paradigm. But what do you reckon about this question?
So Alex and I have been discussing recently, while I'm looking at Motorstorm, that period in the about 2005 to 2008 or 9, where developers were really experimenting a lot with physics and simulation aspects and all sorts of things to sort of increase the granularity of interactions with the world. And then that sort of dropped off. And we've just seen fewer games really push this. And I feel like this extra CPU grunt comes at a time when that actually might be genuinely useful again. And I would love to see more developers tap into that and attempt to bring back physics simulations. Like, I couldn't believe it this week. I'll be honest, like, when I'm playing Motorstorm Pacific Rift and found out that all the foliage actually has touch bending, which again, not unrealistic or anything for that time period, but it's just cool to see that in a racing game when you don't see that anymore. Like, most foliage today, it's like it's designed so like when you collide with it, it just like sort of like pushes it over, or just kind of stretches it. It's not really a really complex physics interaction, and we've lost something there. And I think this is due in part to the Jaguar CPUs in those last generation consoles, and then game development has become very multi-platform, so PC games then were usually derived from that as well, and they're not going to implement these more complex systems in there necessarily. But once we leave those last generation consoles behind, perhaps there will be room to utilize such features once again. And I hope we see it.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am reminded, Alex, of your Far Cry 5 versus
That's
Far
what I was
Cry
just
2.
thinking about.
Yeah. Yep.
It was basically, again, I think it is a factor of hardware balance, right? The PS360 era was very heavy on CPU. And then the balance shifted with the next systems where it was, a comparatively gigantic CPU paired with low power CPU cores. And I think
GPU,
things are, it's kind of, the balance has changed once again. I think we've probably got a far more balanced system.
I think the balance seems pretty solid now. It is funny, though, to look at the PlayStation 3 era specifically, in that the PS3, the RSX is so underpowered that many visual effects had to be run on the CPU on that system. The Cell seemed like a pretty decent CPU for the time. It was a really interesting design, and in fact, the core of Cell is what was used in Xbox 360 for its tri-core CPU as well. So, like, they were doing good stuff on the CPU there, but the GPU side, well, on PS3 at least, was pretty lousy. Despite what Jensen says in that 2005 conference.
Jensen, you liar.
He was wrong. but yeah, so it is true. I think Series X, PS5, they're far more balanced now compared to the last two generations of consoles.
Just speaking personally, I'd like to see a return to the classic Assassin's Creed formula, which was only really ever a thing because of the skewed balance of the Xbox 360 specifically, right? Had a really good CPU. Ubisoft looked at it and thought, hey, wow, we can make this game that's, literally never been seen before. That's kind of what I'd like to see returning. Obviously, with Unreal Engine 5, we're seeing CPU really stress tested in a way that we haven't really seen for a long time. I don't know, any more examples, Alex, before we move on?
I want to see a return to physics-based gameplay that we saw in Red Faction. Oh God, what's the name of it?
Guerrilla?
I always forget the subtitle. Not Armageddon. The one before that. Guerrilla. Yes. Red Faction Guerrilla. I want to see that. We get hints of ideas like that in games occasionally, but for that, the entire gameplay loop, let's be honest with you, was just like, destroy everything. And that's awesome. And the fact that it was done on an Xbox 360 ran well enough there. I mean, not perfect, obviously, but it scaled really well on PC. That game has a pretty interesting PC port, actually, back in the day. I would love to see that again. We haven't seen that in a while. We get hints of that in games, but an entire game based around that, kind of like the way Breath of the Wild is based around its weird systemic stuff.
Yeah, I guess you're right. That is pretty systemic. That's a good example.
Yeah, right? So, like, I would like to see that where a game designs around those things. The only thing is that I don't know how you pitch it to a developer, to like publishing houses, where there's obviously trends in game development. We saw our Destiny likes, they all failed. And then, we saw, everything trying to be Fortnite, trying to be a battle royale. I don't know if it actually fits into the AAA paradigm of actually securing funds for a game. Maybe from Microsoft with Game Pass, I don't know, but I don't know what makes this game come into existence.
With a really strong demo showcasing like crazy physics being directly tied into like a gameplay concept, I bet they could sell that, because that kind of stuff just wows people, right? You could still make a GIF of something from Crysis and people be like, "Whoa!"
It's still amazing.
Like the barrel demos.
Yeah, right. Barrel.
Well, my suggestion would just be go back to Assassin's Creed Unity and say, hey, we can do this now.
Strip out the bad stuff from Unity and you'd have something, it could be really interesting.
Ultimately, it's about having a vision, right? And it's about showing people something they've never seen before that's really exciting. And absolutely having an increased focus on CPU power could enable that, but it does require a vision. Right, and obviously with the UE5 we have one such vision, and it is heavy on CPU. But hopefully we'll see more going forward once cross-gen is done and dusted.
I want to see more interactions in UE5. I know it's focused on the visuals right now, but all the demos are super static right now. You know what I mean? Like Matrix demo, the Valley of the Ancients or whatever it's called. It's all like, it's just like window dressing, and it's beautiful. It's super detailed, but I haven't seen that much from Unreal Engine yet that suggests that they're really pushing this in a new direction in terms of physics and interactions.
So they kind of, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt because their chaos physics system, they switched over from PhysX, from Nvidia's PhysX library to chaos, and apparently in there is some really cool stuff. It just has really yet to be shown in a way that is really awesome, and I don't know exactly how many people will base their game around that because it currently hasn't been a buzz. It hasn't been like the thing that they advertise the engine with it. We saw a tiny bit of it in the Matrix Awakens demo with the way cars function, but which I liked. I do like it. But I want to see a game that's like all about that. I love that stuff. That's the stuff that I love games for, like simulation. I love it.
This one's from Dak. Hey DF, love your videos and content so much! ! Here's my question. With the rise in popularity of dynamic and/or AI-driven optimizations like DRS, DLSS and VRS, is it only a matter of time before we see some sort of low-cost, low-latency frame interpolation technology that can boost the frame rate of a game at the engine level? Many televisions already offer high frame rate interpolation to various degrees of success, but it comes at a significant latency cost. Do you think we'll ever see such a technology built into game engines? Perhaps to push a 30 FPS title to an AI-interpolated 60 FPS without a noticeable sacrifice to quality and latency. So Alex, one might argue that DLSS in improving performance is kind of halfway there already. If you had DLSS producing a 2x performance increase, then that is 30 FPS running at 60 FPS. But I think there have been some papers from Nvidia or hints from Nvidia that they're working on something like this or something related to this, possibly. But do you think the concept has legs, basically?
Yes, I would say it definitely does because DLSS is still limited by the power of your CPU to produce more real simulated frames. And this is all about not simulating, well, maybe not simulating a lot of the frame, simulating maybe parts of it. Let's say like vertex updating their position or something. I don't know, or maybe not even that. Maybe it's just purely on the GPU. And that is where I think there's a lot of scaling potential. How good it can look is another question, but I think it would be really good in the way I see it. I think 30 FPS gaps in frames are really big, and I don't know how well that could be done. But I think 60 to 120 or 120 to, say, 360 or 500, where like Blurbusters always talks about it, like getting those frame rates super high, which is usually impossible, but so you can get like really good motion persistence. That is the way I would love to see this technology be used for getting really amazing motion persistence on PC, and I guess on console there as well too, if the game's hitting 60. But that's the way I would like to see it. I haven't seen any more recent research on it, but I think Nvidia has hinted at it for a while that this is something they're interested in. So I would love to see it. John, I don't know.
Wouldn't this require at least like just an extra frame at the very least added to the latency chain, right? Like,
I feel
like you need source data for this to work. Mm-hmm. And I feel like inherently it's always going to be slightly more latency. But I guess that's also true with stuff like triple buffering, and it's just one of those things you have to sacrifice to get
live
there.
With, right?
So I don't know. I like the idea. It could be really interesting.
I do remember, Alex, that you tweeted words to the effect of this, and one of the key guys behind DLS just replied to it saying, "Yes, very interesting."
Yeah, so I do think they are looking at it, and I still can't find this video. People keep asking me for it, but I did see a video. I'm not hallucinating this, of DLS or DL deep learning principles being applied to make motion blur for a game, which is literally the exact same thing as faking frames. So it's totally doable. I just think they need to find a use case and a way to advertise it if they actually have it working so far. And, NVIDIA always needs an acronym, and they always, they need a way to push it in some way, some sort of, and maybe that could be with their next line of GPUs, that they push a new paradigm. That we already had DLSS.
There we go.
We've got DLFPS now, which I would actually love as an acronym. I would laugh so hard if that was
I'm just laughing at this concept that NVIDIA have developed this game-changing technology but haven't released it because they don't have a name for it or an acronym for it.
Exactly.
I mean,
this is like peak games industry.
yeah, it is. Yeah, jeez.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. This one should be quite simple to answer, and it's from Alcess. Cerny said that the PS5 would have ray-tracing hardware inside, but I've never heard anyone talking about it, and there's little online that I can find. Can you clarify what exactly does the PlayStation 5 have in hardware to support ray-tracing? Well, when I spoke to Mark Cerny about it, he didn't go into depth on it. He just said it's pretty much how it is on PC, which in turn will be pretty much how it is on Xbox Series S. So I suspect that it is almost certainly the same hardware, simply with a different API. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Alex.
It's repurposed TMUs that have perhaps a tiny bit of extra logic in them that allow them to process ray box and ray triangle hits. And that's it. That is what it does. And the rest of it, the traversal part of ray tracing, as in the structure's already been built of like where geometry is, and it's been put into little boxes. And that all stuff is still built on the general compute area. So I think the extra bit of hardware that this LSS is mentioning is the ray triangle intersection unit, the intersection unit, which is a small repurposed part of the TMU, as far as I understand.
Yeah, that's actually RDNA 2.
RDNA 2, yep.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Final question, this one from Racecar spelt backwards. I'll leave you to work that one out. A good one here for John, I think. Hello there, folks. I just bought the so-called OG Xbox. Which games would you consider technological highlights on the system? Can't wait to explore the titles that never made the jump to back compat. Love your content, especially the long-form retro material. Best wishes from the Netherlands! ! John, favourites?
Oh yeah,
the
so
Xbox.
there's a lot of
the
cool
so-called OG Xbox.
The so-called OG Xbox. Yeah, there's a lot of
So
great
many.
tech on there. Two that I always start with actually are Reckless: The Yakuza Missions and its sequel, Japan only, Double Steel: The Second Clash. So these two games are basically sort of like spiritual successors to the Runabout series. So they're driving around big cities, doing crazy stuff. But man, I forget his name, but one of the lead rendering programmers on here was really known for like pushing everything that you could do with those Nvidia GPUs at the time that was in the Xbox. So like GeForce 3 level hardware. And there's just so many visual effects in here. Just awesome looking depth of field and cool like post-processing effects everywhere, and just cool materials work. It had like fully dynamic shadows, which was super rare for the time. And then the sequel, Double Steel 2, actually runs at 720p. So it's an open world game. It has an HDR pipeline internally. It runs at 720p. It's really impressive to see what they were doing at the time. Like, it's just super technology. Beyond that, I would also say Rare did some good stuff on there. Specifically, I think Conker's Bad Fur Day, the remake, is a really beautiful game. Like, just gorgeous environments, great character rendering, none of the performance problems of the N64 version. It's a really great remake. Also, Riddick, I'd say, deserves a shout. It's one of the first games, might be the first game I've ever seen that uses dynamic resolution scaling. It has like full shadows, like the stencil style shadows like you see in Doom 3, which is also on Xbox and pretty impressive. But Riddick's great because it has that full body awareness, so you can actually see, like all the hands and body and interacting with the environment. It's very fluidly animated, but it makes great use of light and shadow. So I definitely recommend that. Anything from Team Ninja, so like Dead or Alive games, of course, Ninja Gaiden, those are just gorgeous still today. Great art direction, super smooth, 60 FPS all around, widescreen support. A weird one that I want to recommend is actually Kakuto Chojin, which is from Dream Factory. It was actually like pulled because it used like there was some reason behind it, but it was pulled from the market. It's a mediocre to good fighting game, but I think it has a really cool visual style that still holds up today. And it's a neat looking game. And I think a lot of these guys had worked on The Bouncer, if I recall. So that's definitely worth it. I don't want to say too many more, but one more I would shout out is Otogi by From Software. which especially the first one, I just love the way this game looks. Like the use of depth of field and the lighting and all the shader tricks they're doing there. It's just a beautiful game in motion. It's essentially like this like dream like ninja world. You're like launching yourself up in the air with all this kind of like it's very elegant in action. So definitely worth taking a look at. So, and honestly, that's just scratching the surface. There's so many other games, but those ones I feel are all very polished and they run at smooth frame rates. And, you know, like, of course, the Splinter Cell games were very impressive, but the frame rates are less so. You know, Halo itself was impressive. You know, I love all the stuff from Sega on there. Outrun looks awesome. You know, JSRF. It's just Panzer Dragoon, of course. Orta. That's absolutely stunning.
What frame rate do the Mech Assault games run at? Do you know?
Who did them?
No, what frame rate do they run at?
They're,
I don't
they're
even
30.
recall.
They're 30.
They're 30? Yeah, that sucks.
Yeah,
There's also Project Gotham Racing 1 and 2.
Yeah,
man,
I think PGR1 is actually holds up better because it actually runs at 60 frames per second. 2 is just 30 with no motion blur because it wasn't much of a thing at the time. And it looks very detailed and it actually uses anti-aliasing, which is cool. But yeah,
That's
PGR1
cool,
for me.
man.
So yeah, absolutely. There's actually a really impressive library of OG Xbox titles out there, and there is a lot of licensing issues in bringing a lot of this content. I think you mentioned Jet Set Radio Future, which is a brilliant game, which I suspect will never be available via back compat, which is a real shame.
It's just it's not feasible. All those music licenses, especially Japanese music licenses, it's a nightmare.
So yeah, hopefully that's plenty of titles for you to be chasing down there. But that's it. That's the end of this particular show. Please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed the content. Ring the bell for those notionally instant notifications. You may or may not get instant notifications. That is my disclaimer. BF supporter program. Get involved. Submit questions. Join our amazing community. Get tons of bonus material.
You can hang out with Alex and agonizing rectal pain.
It's the dream. And yeah, obviously, if you're on the retro tier, you're going to be getting access to that Motorstorm retro episode. Might even be available now. But yes, that's it. That's our show. And we'll see you next week. Okay, let's move on. We're going to talk to... let me do that again. Okay, let's move on. We're going to be... Okay, we're going to...